Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to discuss an article titled, "Scientists Say Your Mind Isn't Confined to Your Brain or Even Your Body," which I believe first appeared in Quartz. The title of this article immediately raises red flags, and in fact it epitomizes two common issues in journalism. First, simply using the term "scientists say," although often technically correct, is also often misleading, and we'll get to that in a moment. And second, redefining a term completely or using a term in a way that is not in general use by most people without letting the audience know up front. In this article's case, the term is mind. So let's start with the use of "scientists say." This is used all the time in all sorts of media, and I'm sure you've seen many headlines with something like this. Unfortunately, it is oftentimes used to deceive or misinform. When used, the implication is that the general scientific consensus is, when in reality, it is often simply saying a couple scientists claim. One of my old mentors in physics once told me, if you talk to one physicist, you'll come away thinking they know everything. If you talk to two physicists together, you'll realize neither knows anything. Although hyperbolic, the idea here is that scientists often disagree, especially in realms with new, ongoing research. So just stating that a scientist or two believes something doesn't give credence to the claim unless actual evidence is provided. It's the evidence that scientists provide that support a claim, not the scientists themselves. So when you see an article that starts with "scientists say," you must ask which scientists. What do they actually say? Not the author's interpretation, which is wrong more often than it should be, and what evidence they have to support the claim. In the case of this article, although technically correct, some scientists have indeed claimed that the mind isn't confined to your brain, the author is misrepresenting what the scientists of the referenced article are actually saying by implying something they don't intend. This is a type of deception by technicality where a person will obviously imply something, but then when called out, they will come back with, "Well, what I said was not technically wrong," allowing them to try and cover up their deceit, ignorance, or mistake. This, for obvious reasons, is very popular with politicians, and this article is a prime example. The early parts of the article, including the title, nudge the reader to think that by mind, the scientists are referring to our conscious and sometimes unconscious selves that dictionary definitions and most people state is the mind. Merriam-Webster, for example, defines the mind as the element or complex of elements in an individual that feels, perceives, thinks, will, and especially reasons. The conscious mental events and capabilities in an organism, and the organized conscious and unconscious adaptive mental activity of an organism. This, of course, says nothing about where the mind is located, just what it is. But in this article, the research the author refers to completely redefines the term mind to mean something very different. But we're not actually told that, thus the deception. So now let's move on to the article itself so we can examine this deception in more detail. The first couple paragraphs are simply introducing the concept of the mind in a manner generally concordant with the dictionary's definition. The article says, "The mind is the seat of consciousness, the essence of your being." Fair enough, but as we will see shortly, the scientists the author is referring to don't define mind this way. This tells us that not only is the author avoiding telling us the difference between the standard definition of mind and that of the researchers, they are actively giving us the wrong definition. Next we see, traditionally scientists have tried to define the mind as a product of brain activity. A quick side note on this type of language use. What is the difference between my stating that I played soccer as a child versus I tried to play soccer as a child? The first tells you that I played soccer as a child. Simple as that. Whereas the second gives the impression that I didn't succeed at playing soccer for whatever reason. This language primes the reader, even subconsciously, to think that scientists failed at trying to define the mind as a product of brain activity. They wanted to define the mind that way, but they couldn't, perhaps due to serious evidence that what we think of as our consciousness exists beyond just being an emergent property of the brain activity. This type of priming is very often used, especially when the writer is trying to convince the reader of something instead of just informing them. Moving on, we have the brain is the physical substance and the mind is the conscious product of those firing neurons, according to the classic argument. But growing evidence shows that the mind goes far beyond the physical workings of your brain. What evidence? Who is making this claim? What claims are actually being made? When someone states that the mind goes far beyond the physical workings of your brain, it can mean all sorts of things, from stating that our body acts as part of the mind to claiming there's a soul or spirit, to our mind being part of a great universal consciousness. This type of statement claiming there's growing evidence of something so non-specific allows each person to interpret what constitutes evidence and what the claim actually is. Don't just assert the existence of this growing body of evidence. Tell us what it is, or at least link to it. I don't know the motives of the author, and giving the benefit of the doubt means not assuming the author is deliberately being deceptive, but instead didn't really understand what they were writing. In addition, I certainly can't assume the author did their own research on the actual evidence, and even if they did, I don't know if they have the skills to properly interpret scientific literature. The author must give us more than simply asserting that the evidence is out there. This is equivalent to someone making a claim that the earth is flat, and then when pressed to provide evidence, they just say that they read it somewhere, or that people say it, or maybe they found a scientist or engineer in some field or another that thinks the earth is flat. Therefore, they can claim scientists admit the earth is flat and there's evidence to show it. At best, it's a meaningless statement. At worst, it's trying to add validity to a claim that has none. I'm not going to go into detail on the evidence that's out there. I certainly did a fair amount of research in hopes of finding something easy to present here, but I found that to really do it justice, I would need to dedicate an entire video to it and all the problems with it. But if you do some research and limit it to personal and religious or spiritual websites that claim out-of-body experiences and such are real, you'll find heaps of cherry-picked data, fully debunked research still presented as valid, stories from people who later admitted lying, unverifiable anecdotes, and people drawing conclusions they want to be true instead of conclusions that the evidence demands. By not presenting this evidence and going through it, it might seem like a bit of a cop-out, but there's honestly just too much out there to cover. So if you don't want to take my word for it, and you shouldn't, there are probably a number of YouTube videos already covering the subject. So in short, don't just accept as truth a simple assertion that evidence exists, especially for extraordinary claims. Demand to see the actual evidence. So let's get back to the article. In the fourth paragraph, we get our first glimpse of what the original researcher has in mind. No doubt, the brain plays an incredibly important role, but our mind cannot be confined to what's inside our skull or even our body. According to a definition first put forward by Dan Siegel, a professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine and the author of the 2016 book, Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human. This is extremely important. Definitions are not evidence, period. Let's look at the definition Dan Siegel, along with some other scientists from different fields, came up with. The mind is the emergent self-organizing process, both embodied and relational, that regulates energy and information flow within and among us. If you want a full discussion by Dan Siegel of this definition and how it came about, see the Big Think link in the description. But it's important to note here that Dan Siegel doesn't follow the dictionary's definition of mind. Instead, states a definition that is much more broad. So next we get, the definition has since been supported by research across the sciences, but much of the original idea came from mathematics. Again, research cannot support a definition, so claiming a definition is supported by research is just wrong. Plus, we are not even told what research the author thinks supports the definition. Again, the author is simply asserting evidence without even providing us a link to it. So let's look at a rather silly example illustrating the problem with claiming evidence exists for a definition. I can define a pair of scissors as a large wood object that grows out of the ground. This is my own personal definition that I use in my head, but I don't tell you that. Next, I tell you my house is surrounded by pairs of scissors. You would be justifiably confused. I could then show you photos of large wood objects growing out of the ground as evidence. But that's only evidence of large wood objects growing out of the ground. It does nothing to prove my definition. When pressed, I could claim that technically I didn't lie about my house being surrounded by scissors, as I had redefined what scissors are, but just in my own head. If I had told you up front about the definition change, you could then concede that yes, my house is surrounded by scissors, but only under this new definition that you accept temporarily as to continue the conversation. This redefining of terms is actually used somewhat regularly in math and other sciences in published papers. When another mathematician or scientist reads the paper, they accept all new or changed definitions of various terms, but only within the scope of the paper, no further. So returning to the mind article, we can see that the claim that Dan Siegel's definition of mind is supported by research is at best meaningless and at worst an attempt at deception. Finally, we get to why Dan Siegel defines the mind the way he does. In his book, he talks about how isolated we are, and if we think about the mind as being more than just internal to ourselves, we might begin to see how important it is for our mental health to think of our mind being as part of a greater social whole. I have absolutely no problem with this. My issue only comes in how the article's author presents this redefining of the mind as being something more than it is, a simple redefining, as opposed to some beyond the physical brain consciousness or other supernatural interpretation. In addition, the way the article is written, if the reader doesn't read all the way to the end, as readers often don't do, they can easily be left with an idea that Dan Siegel never intended. Even if the reader reads the entire article, it would be very easy to walk away with the wrong idea, especially if the reader is predisposed to believing supernatural claims. A quick Google search will provide you with piles of websites, many of which claim the existence of the soul, spirit, etc., reposting this article. You will also find this article posted in forums as evidence of the mind existing outside the body. It is also very important to see that the research done by Dan Siegel in no way supports the existence of a soul, spirit, universal consciousness, or other supernatural entity. It simply attempts to change how we think of our own mind to help with our all too common feelings of isolation. Some of what I talked about today may seem a bit nitpicky, but the devil truly is in the details. If a person does a quick Google search on evidence of the mind existing outside the body, they will get a plethora of articles with a title similar to this one. Even if they click on an article and read the first couple paragraphs, they will walk away thinking there really is actual evidence of the soul, spirit, universal consciousness, etc. When in fact none of these articles actually provide evidence. They are simply presented in a clickbaity, hyperbolic manner. So, in closing, watch out for deception by technicality, using words in a non-standard way but not immediately making it abundantly clear to the reader. Deception by authority, simply claiming scientists say, even if it's only a few scientists, or in the case of this article, misrepresenting the claims of the scientists or claiming the scientists have evidence that they don't even claim to have. And deceptive attempts to bolster an argument by simply claiming there is evidence without providing any. And remember to always ask yourself if you believe something simply because you want that something to be true, or if you believe it because the evidence actually demands it. And if we can't put into words any counter arguments to our beliefs, we should research them thoroughly, as not knowing or understanding the reasoning of those people with whom we disagree leaves us very vulnerable to deceit. I should also state that just because I reject the claims of a person doesn't mean I believe the opposite of their claims, nor does it mean the claim is actually false. A lack of evidence for a claim simply means we can't pass judgment on the veracity of the claim until more knowledge is gained. That's all for this article. So if you find this content useful, please like and subscribe, and please provide any feedback you might have in the comments below, and I will try to respond. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.